Hi, I'm Jamie Flinchball, and today I want to share a bit of a book review. I've always been interested in people's different takes on solving problems, especially different problem solving approaches for really complex problems. I find that fascinating, and perhaps since I've written the book, I actually find it even more interesting that there's different approaches to these problems. So one of those challenges is, of course, racism and systematic racism that goes along with that. And most efforts at targeting this from a problem-solving standpoint really go to the core of racism, or they go after sort of the symptoms of racism. We're going to counterbalance the symptoms with other solutions that outweigh what happens because of racism. So I want to share a different book called Addressing Systematic Discrimination by Reframing the Problem. And so first, this is called systematic discrimination and not just racism. So what I find about this book that's different is really that it's looking at the occurrence of that discrimination and what happens. Now, this book is from I'll say a colleague, but a fellow Lehigh graduate, Frank Douglas. He got his undergrad at Lehigh, but went on to get his MD and PhD at Cornell. So unparalleled academic criteria, but then his progress in industry and then in academia as well, an incredible career, and really did it through his own experiences facing down basically discrimination from one step to the next. And so that experience that he has underneath his long and very successful career really goes to frame a bit about this book. So he's now turned his attention to addressing systemic discrimination through a unique aspect of problem solving, unique approach to problem solving in this space. And I found the book fascinating just to sort of take on a different aspect. I'm not going to share all of what's in the book. I want you to buy it and read it for yourself. Um, but it starts sort of with a framework, really looking at equity and inclusion because it's focused on the individual's experience, what they go through. So you sort of when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, well, diversity is already taken care of. You're there. You're there. You're in a situation. You're not getting the equity in terms of outcomes and the inclusion in terms of your experience that leads to what he calls the engaged employee, which ultimately, if you get equity right, you get inclusion right, you get engaged employees, which of course every company wants. You give somebody a paycheck, you want the most out of that individual. And to do that, you must have an engaged employee. That's one of those core outcomes that we need from everybody, or certainly pursue for everyone. So what stands in the way of that? And it provides a framework to sort of analyze and break down the situation in terms of equity, in terms of inclusion for that individual's experience based on their story, and puts it together to understand both the outcomes for that individual, but also the pathway forward. Now, one of the interesting as it gets into more of the process in the book, it's really a combination, in my view, of framework plus process. And you put the two together, and that's where you get your unique approach to problem solving. And a big aspect of it is essentially adding the word realistic. What's a realistic outcome? What's a realistic time frame? And some things that might be the right thing to do, but might not be realistic, or might not be realistic in the time frame that it's required for it to affect someone. You might decide, well, we need to fundamentally change the culture of this organization. Well, is that realistically going to affect this one person's experience soon enough that it is, again, realistic? And so when it's not realistic, it takes great pains to look at what is a better problem to solve. And as I talk about breaking down problems and people solve problems, a lot of times that's what a big part of what you're doing is not looking at the whole problem and just saying here's one big problem, but breaking it down and say, well, I'm not going to solve this problem, I might solve this problem instead. And the better you break problems down, the better you can analyze what is a better problem to solve. And so examining that, actually ideating what is a better problem to solve is a tremendously powerful mechanism look at problems in a different way. And then goes on from there to reframe the problem, which of course is a core of the book title and the whole process. Through it, there's a lot of aspects of how his organization actually goes about doing this with organizations. And I won't get into a lot of that because, again, a lot of it's in the book and specific to his organization. Um, but the book is really sort of a front end describing the framework, describing the process, and then a whole series of case studies that really get into the nitty gritty of how all this works. So if you're just interested in problem solving, I think there's some unique lessons to be learned from this book. If you're interested in systematic racism, systematic discrimination, and of course, actually solving those problems, I think it's probably a fundamental book to have on your shelf, in your hands first, then on your shelf, just because it does tackle it from a different approach. And I think that's uh, tremendously powerful to look at different angles, not to discount, sort of solving racism and solving the symptoms, but to also solve the occurrences is a pretty powerful approach. So I encourage you to get the book, read it for yourself, and of course, put it to good use. Thanks.